Thank you so much for joining us today for this virtual visit to Flora Cliff Nature Sanctuary. My name is Josie Miller. As the Stewardship Director here at Flora Cliff, I work with volunteers and conservation professionals to take care of the land and its many natural communities. So while you're here today, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about how Flora Cliff came to be, how and why we use the conservation practices we use, and how you can use some of those in your own life. So there's a lot to see here, so let's hit the trail. With almost 350 acres, there's a lot of ground to cover at Flora Cliff. We're located in the Inner Bluegrass region in Lexington, Kentucky. So if you've never been here before, you may be expecting the rolling topography of a horse farm. In fact, it's pretty steep and rugged here, and we've got a lot of rocky outcrops. Behind me, maybe you can see the Palisades of the Kentucky River. Our founder, Dr. Mary Wharton, understood the Palisades was an important migratory corridor. She also recognized that land in this area was being lost to our human activities. And so she dedicated her life and her financial resources to protecting this area, the land here, and its natural communities. Since then, we've also received legal protection through the Office of Kentucky Nature Preserves, as well as the Heritage Land Conservation Fund. Today, we continue to focus on Dr. Wharton's priorities. We protect the land and its natural communities, we restore ecological function to degraded habitats, and we share nature with wildlife and our own communities. In today's world, it's not enough to call land protected and walk away and let nature take its course. The ecosystems that we're protecting are largely impacted by our human activities, particularly the introduction of invasive plants. And so what is an invasive plant? Well, an invasive plant is a plant that's been moved from one place in the world where in its native range, where it is performing an ecological function, into a new place where it no longer performs an ecological function and it actually causes harm. And so these invasive plants can cause harm by outcompeting our native plants because the invasive plants no longer have their natural enemies. So it's our responsibility as humans who have moved these invasive plants around the world and as good stewards of the earth to remove the invasive species and repair the ecosystems that we've harmed. Plants perform a number of services in keeping our earth habitable. They sequester carbon, they release oxygen, they build soil and cycle nutrients, and slow and filter water. In a functioning ecosystem, plants also provide a food source. So native plants, those that have evolved in a particular region, are usually the best food source for our native insects and other herbivores. That's because these animals are well adapted to utilize these plants as a food source. Introduced plants, on the other hand, are often not able to be used as a food source, and so they don't contribute to the food web. Although these introduced plants may perform other ecosystem services, since they're not contributing to the food web, they're not a good replacement for our native plants that are a part of our food web. So I'm standing next to a couple of plants here that are an important part of our food web. Right here is spicebush, and you can recognize that by those early spring yellow flowers. And then here next to me is pawpaw, and you can recognize the kind of paintbrush looking bud on the end of it here. You'll notice neither of these have leaves on them yet, but when they do get their leaves, they'll be an important larval food source for caterpillars. So another term you probably know for this is a host plant. Spicebush is a host plant to the spicebush swallowtail caterpillar, and pawpaw is a host plant for a number of different Lepidoptera, so both moth species as well as the zebra swallowtail caterpillar. Pawpaw, this common pawpaw here is the only host plant for our zebra swallowtail caterpillar to become a zebra swallowtail butterfly in the state of Kentucky. So you can see these are both very important plants for our food web, and by allowing more native plants to grow where you live or planting more native plants where you live, you can help to create a more functioning ecosystem. Here's an example of an introduced plant that is not a functional part of our food web. This is amberbush honeysuckle, or Lonicera macii, and it was introduced into North America in the late 1800s as an ornamental. People planted it a lot in gardens, both public and private gardens. And in the 1960s through the 1980s, it was also used both for soil conservation as well as wildlife habitat improvement projects. Since then, it has escaped into our natural areas, and it is now one of our worst invasive plants in Kentucky. unlike our native plants like pawpaw or spicebush, very few caterpillars are actually adapted to eat honeysuckle, and so it's really not a good part of our food web here in Kentucky. Some deer will eat honeysuckle sometimes, but generally they prefer to eat our native wildflowers as well as our native tree seedlings. They'll actually preferentially browse these native plants, giving honeysuckle an even greater competitive advantage. And birds will eat the berries, but they're not nutritious like our other berries that they need in the fall. So spicebush or maybe dogwood or viburnum have a much more nutritious berry when birds need that for fall migration or also for overwintering. And also birds will spread those berries into our natural areas. So you can see that not only are these plants not contributing to the food web, but actually the interactions that they do have with our native wildlife are causing more biodiversity decline. So as we know, just because Flora Cliff is protected as a nature sanctuary, it doesn't mean leaving it alone is the best management strategy. In order to protect our native plant communities, we remove invasive species. By removing these species, we give the native plants that are here more resources like light and nutrients and water to thrive. But as you know, we're a very big nature sanctuary, and so we have to prioritize where we work. We generally work in the areas that have the most intact biodiversity. By working in these areas that have the most interacting species, we know that these areas will more likely recover quickly compared to areas that have more past land disturbance. So this is our current habitat restoration site at Flora Cliff. It's about 7.5 acres, and we work with our regional conservation biologist to help us plan these projects and also fund these projects. So you can see I'm surrounded here by bush honeysuckle. It's really taken over the area. There are not a whole lot of other native shrubs that are growing here. Honeysuckle has really outcompeted them. You can also see that the honeysuckle is starting to leaf out already, and that's different than our native plants that you saw earlier like spicebush and pawpaw. By leafing out early, honeysuckle is taking advantage of that early spring sun, and honeysuckle actually stays leafed out really late in the year. So they have a different cycle than our native plants in that they have a longer time that they can photosynthesize. Besides shading out our native shrubs, this is also really detrimental to our native wildflowers. So we do have some spring ephemeral wildflowers here, but these wildflowers are really adapted to take advantage of the early spring sunlight. And when honeysuckle leaves out early like this, it shades out these plants before they can finish their reproductive life cycle. So now that we know why it's so important to be removing invasive plants to protect our natural communities, I just want to show you kind of how we do it at Flora Cliff, and then talk about some ways that you can do it in your own life. So when we remove invasive plants, we use the cut stump method, which means we use either loppers or a handsaw to cut the plants at the base. And we really prefer using these quiet tools because you may have heard all the wildlife in the background here. These quiet tools allow us a little bit more opportunity to see and hear those animals that we're protecting. After we make the cut, we apply a small amount of herbicide. Now, if you're using herbicide in Kentucky and it's not on your own land, you are required to have a pesticide license. So we do that through the state of Kentucky. And then, of course, not everyone wants to use pesticide on their land or on somebody else's property. So there's some alternative methods you can use as well. So the first method would be hand pulling. This is good for small plants, and this can be done any time of year when the soil is moist. The second method would be to use a mattock or a shovel or some other sort of weed wrenching tool to pull the plants from the ground. And this can be done on medium-sized plants any time of year as well, as long as the soil is moist. The thing about these two methods is, first of all, you have to make sure to get the entire root crown or the plant will resprout. And the second thing is that this can cause a lot of soil erosion. So you need to kind of put the soil back and the leaf cover back in order that new seedlings don't emerge from the soil. The third method that I haven't used too much before, but is another option, would be what I'm calling the cut and starve method. So you cut the plant high and you know that it will resprout because that's what honeysuckle does. And after it's resprouted, maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, you come back and you cut off or break off any buds that are emerging. This method takes a lot of persistence. You'll need to revisit the plant for at least a year and probably longer than that. But it can be done. and it's a great way to take care of the honeysuckle invasion that's happening around you. So I'm standing now in last year's habitat restoration site. We worked in this 7-acre site with volunteers to remove all of the honeysuckle using the cut stump method with handsaws and loppers. And so we've piled the honeysuckle into brush piles here that will make great habitat for our songbirds and other small animals to use. But of course, habitat restoration is an ongoing process, so we know that we're not finished with this site yet. We'll need to return this summer to remove any honeysuckle plants that we've missed. And then, of course, during the spring, we'll be working on removing other invasive species. So right now we're working on removing garlic mustard, and then we'll also be removing winter creeper, so we hand pull both of those plants. But if you look around me, you may notice that there's not really a lot of understory here, a lot of other shrubs of the size of honeysuckle, and that's because honeysuckle really did outcompete all our native plants in this area. There are a few spicebush around me, but not a lot of those. And then if you could see the ground, there's also there's a few sedges and a few grasses, but mostly the only wildflower in here is dwarf larkspur. So we don't have that diversity of wildflowers that we had in the other areas. This area has really been impacted, but we hope to see in the next several years more of our spring wildflowers and our native shrubs rebounding in this area. This will take some time, of course, but we'll be persistent with it, and we know that the more wildflowers we have and the more diversity of shrubs, the more of our native wildlife we'll be supporting. So now that you know more about why and how we protect our natural communities at Floracliff, let's review just a few options for how you can do the same in your life. The first thing would be to remove invasive plants. So remember, invasive plants cause a problem because they both are not part of our food web and also they're limiting biodiversity. A second thing you can do is plant more native plants in your yard or in your neighborhood. You can visit your local nursery and they can give you the best information on what's local to your region. A third thing you can do is participate in apps like Seek or iNaturalist to document what you're seeing, when you're seeing, and who's using those plants that you're seeing. And then a fourth thing that you could do is just to tell everybody what you're doing. So tell your friends and tell your family and tell your neighbors what you're doing to conserve our natural areas where you live. If we all do a little piece where we live, we can make a big difference for conservation worldwide.